The morning of George's funeral was unseasonably cold for October in Ohio. The maple trees outside Eternal Rest Memorial Chapel had turned that brilliant amber that always reminded me of my husband's eyes when he laughed. But George wasn't laughing anymore. He'd been gone for 2 weeks, and I was still walking through the world like someone had removed all the sound from my life. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror that morning, adjusting the black dress I'd bought specifically for this day. Not because I was unprepared for death, but because every other black dress in my closet held memories of happier occasions. This one was sterile, appropriate for the sterile grief I was supposed to display for the cameras and distant relatives who would judge how well I was holding up. The house felt enormous without George's presence. 32 years of marriage, and suddenly I was rattling around in 5 bedrooms like a marble in an empty jar. Our children, Alexander, 31, Daisy, 29, and Gabriel, 26, had barely visited during George's final weeks. Too busy with their own lives, they said important work commitments, young families to manage. I understood, of course. I'd raised them to be independent, successful people. I just hadn't realized I'd raised them to be strangers. The funeral home smelled like lilies and industrial carpet cleaner. George lay in the mahogany casket we'd picked out together 20 years earlier during one of those morbid conversations married couples have about their eventual deaths. He looked peaceful, younger somehow, as if dying had erased the stress lines that had deepened during his final months fighting pancreatic cancer. I took my place in the front row, smoothing my dress and checking my watch. 10 minutes before the service, and my children still hadn't arrived. The chapel was filling with George's colleagues from the engineering firm, neighbors, members of our church, people who cared enough to show up, to sit quietly in uncomfortable chairs and listen to a pastor who barely knew my husband try to summarize a life. "Mom," Daisy's voice behind me. Finally, I turned to see all 3 of them walking down the aisle together, a united front in their expensive black clothes. Alexander in his tailored suit that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 2 months. Daisy in designer heels that clicked against the tile with military precision. Gabriel with his perfectly groomed beard and the watch George had given him for his college graduation. They looked like success. They looked like the American dream realized. They looked like everything George and I had worked toward during those lean years when we ate generic cereal for dinner so they could have name-brand lunch money. "We need to talk after the service," Alexander said, leaning down to kiss my cheek. His cologne was sharp, expensive. About Dad's arrangements. About practical matters. Practical matters. Even then, something cold settled in my stomach, but I nodded, squeezed his hand, and told myself that grief made everyone awkward. That they were just trying to take care of business so I wouldn't have to worry about it. The service passed in a blur of hymns I'd heard 1,000 times and condolences from people who kept calling George a good man. He was more than good. He was extraordinary in all the quiet ways that don't make headlines. He remembered every anniversary, not just ours, but the kids' first jobs, first apartments, first heartbreaks. He saved newspaper clippings about their achievements in a scrapbook he thought no one knew about. He called me beautiful every morning for 32 years, even when I was wearing his old t-shirt and had mascara smudged under my eyes. But good man would have to suffice for the crowd. When Pastor Williams asked if anyone wanted to share memories, I expected one of my children to stand up. They had so many stories. Camping trips where George taught them to tie knots and identify constellations, Sunday mornings when he made elaborate pancake breakfasts that looked like animals, the way he never missed a soccer game or school play or science fair, even when work kept him up until 3 a.m. the night before. Instead, Alexander stood and walked to the podium with the confidence of someone accustomed to boardroom presentations. Daisy and Gabriel flanked him, creating a tableau that looked rehearsed. "Thank you all for being here today," Alexander began, his voice carrying clearly through the chapel's sound system. "Our father was a man who believed in family, in tradition, in taking care of the people he loved." I felt a flutter of pride. This was more like it. My eldest son honoring his father properly. Dad worked hard his whole life to build something lasting, Alexander continued. He wanted to make sure his family would be secure, that his legacy would continue through us, and we want everyone here to know that we take that responsibility seriously. Daisy stepped forward slightly, her lawyer's training evident in her posture. Dad made it clear that he trusted us to carry on what he built. The business, the investments, the properties, everything he worked for will stay in the family, managed by those who understood his vision. My breath caught. Something was happening here that I didn't understand, some script they'd rehearsed that I hadn't been given. Gabriel, my youngest, my baby who used to crawl into bed with George and me during thunderstorms, looked directly at me as he spoke the words that would change everything. He left everything to us. Our mother will be well taken care of. From a distance, the chapel fell silent except for the soft hum of the ventilation system. From a distance, the phrase hung in the air like smoke, visible and choking. I felt every eye in the room turn toward me, some curious, some pitying, some uncomfortable with the naked cruelty they'd just witnessed. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, my wedding ring cutting into my finger where I'd been twisting it unconsciously. Nobody looked me in the eyes after that, not the pastor when he continued. I included the service, not the funeral director when he offered his practiced condolences. Not my own children when they filed past my chair to accept sympathy from guests who didn't quite know what to say anymore, from a distance, as if I were a problem to be managed, a burden to be minimized, a loose end to be tidily handled by their father's careful estate planning. But here's what my children didn't know as they shook hands and accepted casseroles and promised to stay in touch with people I'd considered family friends. I had helped George write that will, every single clause, every distribution, every trust and annuity, and property transfer. We'd spent months with lawyers making sure everything was exactly as we wanted it, and we'd planned for this possibility, the possibility that our children might forget who had raised them. 1 week later, as I sat in the lawyer's office watching their faces transform from smug satisfaction to complete horror, I finally understood what George had meant when he told me 3 days before he died, "Lola, some lessons can only be learned the hard way." Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Trust me, you'll want to see how this ends. The week between George's funeral and the reading of his will was the longest 7 days of my life, not because I was grieving. I'd been grieving for months while watching cancer eat away at the man I loved. No, it was long because I was waiting for my children to realize exactly how much they'd underestimated the woman who'd raised them. I spent those days cleaning out George's closet, methodically folding his shirts and pants into donation boxes. His cologne still lingered on the fabric, that woody scent he'd worn since our first anniversary. I found things tucked away in his sock drawer, old birthday cards from the kids, photos from family vacations, ticket stubs from movies we'd seen together, evidence of a life fully lived, fully loved. But I also found the folder. It was labeled Lola's Security in George's careful handwriting, hidden behind his winter sweaters. Inside were copies of documents I'd helped him prepare, bank statements I'd reviewed, correspondence with lawyers I'd sat beside during countless meetings. My children thought their father had been handling business during those long afternoons when they were too busy to visit. In reality, we'd been preparing for war. The phone calls started on day 3. Alexander first, his voice carrying that patronizing tone he'd perfected in business school. "Mom, we need to discuss your living situation. The house is obviously too big for you now, and the maintenance costs. I'm not discussing anything until after the will reading," I told him, my voice steadied despite the fury building in my chest. "Look, I know this is emotional for you, but Dad was very clear about his wishes. We're just trying to make the transition easier." Transition, as if my life were a corporate restructuring, something to be managed with efficiency. Daisy called the next day, her lawyer's training evident in how she framed the conversation. "Mom, we've been looking at assisted living facilities. There's a lovely place in Parma Heights. I'm 53 years old, Daisy. I don't need assisted living. Well, no, of course not now, but Dad wanted us to plan ahead to make sure you had support systems in place. Independence is important, but so is security. Security from a distance, their new favorite phrase apparently. Gabriel's call was the most painful because he'd always been my baby, the one who still sometimes slipped and called me Mama when he was tired or stressed. His voice was gentle, almost apologetic. I know this is hard, Mom, but Dad really did want what's best for you. He talked to us about it before he got too sick. He was worried about you being alone in that big house, about your financial security if something happened to his investments. And what did you tell him? I asked. We promised we'd take care of you, that you'd never have to worry about anything. Take care of me like I was a stray cat they'd decided to feed but couldn't quite bring themselves to bring inside. The morning of the will reading, I dressed carefully, not in the widow's weeds my children probably expected, but in the navy blue dress George had always said brought out my eyes, paired with the pearl necklace he'd given me for our 25th anniversary. I looked in the mirror and saw not a grieving widow to be managed, but a woman who'd spent 32 years learning every detail of her husband's business. Whitman and Associates had been handling our legal affairs for 15 years. James Whitman himself had worked with George and me on estate planning, business succession, even the prenup George had insisted I sign when he started making serious money. Just protecting both of us, he'd said, and I'd trusted him completely. Maybe that should have been my first warning sign about trusting men who claimed to be protecting me. The law office occupied the top 2 floors of a downtown Cleveland high-rise. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of Lake Erie, gray and choppy under October clouds. I arrived 15 minutes early and was shown to a conference room with a table that could seat 12 people. For a family of 4, it felt absurdly large, but then again, maybe that was the point. My children arrived together, as they had at the funeral. Alexander carried a leather portfolio that probably contained documents they'd prepared for my signature. Daisy had her own legal pad, notes already written in her precise handwriting. Gabriel looked uncomfortable, but he stayed close to his siblings, their united front intact. Lola, James Whitman said as he entered the room, his expression carefully neutral. I'm so sorry for your loss. George was a good man. Another good man. I nodded politely and took my seat at the head of the conference table, the place George would have occupied if he'd been there to watch this unfold. James opened the folder containing George's will and adjusted his reading glasses before we begin. I want to make sure everyone understands that this document represents George's final wishes, prepared with full legal counsel and witnessed according to Ohio state law. The will is quite specific and leaves little room for interpretation. Alexander leaned forward, his confidence evident. We understand Dad was very thorough. Yes, he was. James glanced at me, and for just a moment, I saw something that might have been sympathy or maybe anticipation. The last revision was completed just 6 weeks before his death. Daisy frowned. Revision? We weren't aware of any changes. George felt it was important to ensure all contingencies were covered, James said smoothly. Now shall we begin? The will started exactly as my children expected. The house, the cars, the investment portfolio, the business interests. Everything significant went to my beloved children, Alexander George Jones, Daisy Elizabeth Jones Morrison, and Gabriel Thomas Jones, to be managed jointly as they see fit. I watched their faces relax and saw Alexander make a small check mark on his legal pad. This was going according to their script. However, James continued, his voice taking on a different quality. There are several important cautions to these bequests. Cautions, the lawyer word for surprises. First, all bequests to the children are contingent upon their continued care and support of their mother, Lola Jones, for the remainder of her natural life. This support must include, but is not limited to, appropriate housing, medical care, and a monthly allowance of no less than $8,000. The confidence drained from Alexander's face like water from a broken glass. Daisy's pen had stopped moving across her legal pad. Gabriel was staring at James as if the words weren't making sense. Second, James continued, his voice gaining momentum. Should any of the children fail to meet these obligations, or should they attempt to place Lola Jones in any form of institutional care against her wishes, their individual share of the estate will be immediately forfeited and redistributed to charity. That's when Daisy started, then stopped, her legal training warring with her shock. Third, George has established a trust fund of $500,000 specifically for Lola's use, with herself as the sole trustee. This fund is separate from and in addition to the support obligations outlined above. The room had gone completely silent, except for the soft hum of the building's heating system. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, watching my children's faces transform from confusion to understanding to something approaching panic. But James wasn't finished. Finally, there is a personal letter from George to his family, which he requested be read at this time. He pulled out a sealed envelope, broke the wax seal with George's signet ring, the one Gabriel was supposed to inherit, and unfolded 2 sheets of paper covered in my husband's familiar handwriting. My dear children, James began reading. If you are hearing this letter, it means I am gone and you are learning the true terms of my will. I hope you are surprised. I hope you are shocked. I hope you are beginning to understand that actions have consequences and that the woman you just tried to discard is the same woman who helped me build everything you're now fighting over. James paused, glancing around the conference table. The silence was deafening. Alexander had gone pale, his expensive suit suddenly seeming to hang loose on his frame. Daisy was gripping her pen so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Gabriel looked like he might be sick. I remained perfectly still, watching my children's world collapse with the same detached interest I might observe a controlled demolition on the evening news. The letter continues, James said, clearing his throat. You probably think this is about money. It isn't. This is about respect. This is about remembering who sacrificed her own dreams so you could chase yours. Your mother worked 2 jobs while going to nursing school so I could focus on building my business. She gave up her career advancement opportunities every time one of you needed her. She postponed her own graduate degree for 15 years because your needs always came first. Alexander found his voice first. This can't be legal. Dad wouldn't have done this without discussing it with us. I know you're thinking this isn't legal, James continued reading, and I had to suppress a smile at how well George had anticipated this moment. It is. Your mother and I spent months with lawyers making sure every word would hold up in court. We planned for your shock, your anger, your inevitable attempts to contest this will. We have video testimony, witnesses, medical evaluations proving my mental competency. We thought of everything. Daisy leaned forward, her lawyer instincts kicking in despite her shock. When was this revision made? Dad was on heavy pain medication the last 2 months. The revision was completed and signed on August 15th, James interrupted. George was lucid, had been off pain medication for a full week on his doctor's orders specifically for this purpose, and had 3 independent medical evaluations confirming his mental capacity. Would you like to see the documentation? She nodded wordlessly, and James slid a thick folder across the table. Daisy opened it with trembling hands, scanning the medical reports, the psychiatric evaluation, the cognitive assessments, all confirming what she didn't want to believe. Their father had been completely aware of what he was doing when he decided to teach them a lesson. The letter continues, James said, but this isn't just about punishment. It's about giving you a chance to become the people we raised you to be. Lola and I always believed that adversity reveals character. Well, here's your adversity, your inheritance. Everything I worked 60 years to build depends entirely on how you treat the woman who made it all possible. Gabriel finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. How long do we have to take care of her for the remainder of her natural life? James replied matter-of-factly, the will is quite specific about the terms of care required. I watched Gabriel's face crumple as the reality hit him. He was 26 years old and probably assumed he had 30 or 40 more years ahead of him, 30 or 40 years of $8,000 per month, 30 or 40 years of being responsible for his housing, his medical care, his general welfare, 30 or 40 years of remembering that they'd tried to throw him away. "There's more," James said, returning to the letter. "I know this seems harsh. I know you're angry. I know you're probably looking at your mother right now and wondering how she could have been part of this. But here's what you need to understand. She tried to stop me when I first proposed this arrangement. Lola begged me to reconsider. She said you were good children who just lost your way, that you'd remember your values once the shock of losing me wore off." That part was true. I had tried to talk George out of the more vindictive aspects of his plan, not because I thought our children deserved mercy, but because I believed they might actually learn from their mistake without such dramatic consequences. I'd been wrong about that too. "She wanted to give you the benefit of the doubt," James continued. "But I knew better. I knew that without consequences, you'd continue treating her like an obligation instead of honoring her like the extraordinary woman she is. So I made the consequences impossible to ignore." Alexander stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I need some air. This is insane." "Sit down, Alexander," I said quietly. It was the first time I'd spoken since entering the conference room, and my voice carried a tone I'd never used with my children before, not the voice of their patient, long-suffering mother, but the voice of someone who'd spent 30 years learning how to command respect in hospital emergency rooms. He sat. "If you're thinking you can just contest this will and be done with it, let me save you the time and legal fees," James read. "Your mother has her own attorney, one we hired specifically for this purpose. She has copies of every document, every asset inventory, every financial record. She knows exactly what you're inheriting and exactly what it's worth. More importantly, she knows what it cost her to help me build it." Daisy was frantically taking notes now, her legal mind working even through her shock. "What about the business?" "Dad's company can't be managed from a distance. The business operations are handled through a separate trust," James explained. "Your father established a board of directors that includes his 3 most senior partners. You'll receive the profits, but you won't be involved in day-to-day operations unless you choose to be, and only if you're qualified." "Unless we choose to be?" Alexander's voice cracked slightly. "That's my father's company. I've been working there for 8 years. And you'll continue working there if you meet your obligations to your mother," James said calmly. "The business succession is contingent on the same terms as everything else." I watched the full scope of their situation dawn on them. This wasn't just about money. It was about their entire futures, their careers, their identities as George Jones's successful children. Everything they'd built their adult lives around was now dependent on treating me with the respect they should have shown all along. "I hope you're beginning to understand," James continued. "Your mother isn't the burden you tried to make her out to be. She's the foundation everything else was built on. If you can't honor that foundation, then you don't deserve what was built on top of it." The letter went on for another page, outlining specific requirements. I was to live in my own home for as long as I chose. I was to have complete autonomy over my medical decisions. I was to be included in all major family decisions and consulted on any matters affecting my welfare. The monthly allowance was to be paid on the 1st of each month, no exceptions, no delays. But the most important clause was saved for last. Your mother has the sole discretion to determine whether you are meeting these obligations. Her word is final. There is no appeal process, no mediation, no second chances. If she decides you have failed in your duties, you forfeit everything immediately. James folded the letter and looked around the table. There are additional documents outlining the specific charitable organizations that would receive the forfeited assets, but I think you understand the general terms. Alexander was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, not even resentment, but something approaching fear. "Mom, you can't seriously be going along with this." I met his gaze steadily. Your father and I were partners for 32 years, Alexander, in everything. Did you really think you would make decisions about our life together without consulting me? Daisy closed her legal pad with a sharp snap. This is extortion. No, I said, my voice remaining perfectly calm. This is accountability. For the first time in your adult lives, your actions have real consequences. Your father thought that might motivate you to remember who raised you. Gabriel was crying now, quiet tears that he wiped away with the back of his hand. Mom, please, we're sorry about what we said at the funeral. We were grieving. We weren't thinking clearly. You weren't grieving, I interrupted. You were calculating. You saw an opportunity to solve what you perceived as the problem of your aging mother, and you took it in front of a room full of people who'd known me for decades. The meeting concluded with James distributing copies of all relevant documents and explaining the legal procedures for transferring assets. My children signed where they needed to sign, their movements mechanical, defeated. As we prepared to leave, Daisy made one last attempt at damage control. Mom, we should talk as a family, work out the details of how this is going to work. I gathered my purse and stood smoothing my dress. The details are quite clear, Daisy. You have my phone number when you're ready to discuss how you plan to make amends. I walked out of that conference room with my head high, leaving my 3 children to contemplate the wreckage of their assumptions. They thought they were inheriting their father's empire. Instead, they'd inherited their mother's judgment. The first 24 hours after the will reading were silent. No phone calls, no visits, no desperate attempts at reconciliation. I spent the time methodically going through George's papers, organizing the financial documents I'd need to monitor my children's compliance with their new obligations. Every bank statement, every investment portfolio, every asset valuation, I knew it all by heart now. Knowledge, I was learning, was its own form of power. I was sitting at George's desk in his home office when the doorbell rang at precisely 9 a.m. the next morning. Through the front window, I could see Alexander's BMW in the driveway, polished and gleaming like his reputation. He stood on my front porch in another expensive suit, holding a large bouquet of white roses, my favorite, though he'd probably had to ask his wife to remember that detail. Mom, he said when I opened the door, his voice carefully modulated to sound contrite. I brought you flowers. May I come in? I stepped aside wordlessly and led him to the living room, where George and I had spent countless evenings watching the news and discussing our days. Alexander perched on the edge of the sofa, the roses awkward in his hands. I want to apologize, he began, clearly having rehearsed this speech. What we said at Dad's funeral was inexcusable. We were overwhelmed, grieving, not thinking straight. We never meant to hurt you. I settled into George's recliner, the leather still shaped to his body, and studied my eldest son. He looked tired, older than his 31 years. The stress of the last 24 hours had carved new lines around his eyes. What you meant, I said quietly, was to dispose of me as efficiently as possible. You had plans, Alexander, probably spreadsheets detailing the cost savings of moving me into some facility where I'd be someone else's problem. His face flushed. That's not, we were trying to look out for your best interests. My best interests according to whom? Mom, please, let's not do this. I'm here to make things right. Are you? I leaned back in the chair, my hands folded in my lap, because I'm curious what making things right looks like to you. Alexander reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I've drafted a care plan, a schedule for how Daisy, Gabriel, and I will rotate responsibility for your needs: weekly grocery shopping, monthly medical appointments, regular home maintenance checks. We want to make sure you never feel alone or unsupported. I took the paper and scanned his neat handwriting. It was exactly what I'd expected. A corporate solution to a human problem. Tasks assigned, responsibilities delegated, efficiency maximized. This is very thorough. I said, refolding the paper. You've scheduled me like a business meeting. I'm trying to be organized about this to make sure nothing falls through the cracks. And the $8,000 monthly, how have you decided to handle that? Logistics? His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. We'll set up an automatic transfer the first of every month, as specified. From which account? We'll work that out among ourselves. I nodded slowly. You haven't figured out how to divide the cost yet. You're hoping one of your siblings will volunteer to carry the larger burden. Alexander's composure cracked slightly. Mom, that money, it's going to be difficult. $8,000 a month is $96,000 a year for potentially 30 or 40 years. That's nearly $4 million. I finished. Yes, your father and I calculated that when we established the requirement. But don't you think that's excessive? I mean, your expenses can't possibly what? Alexander asked. Can't possibly be worth what you're paying. Can't possibly justify the inconvenience to your lifestyle. He set the roses on the coffee table and leaned forward, his business negotiation instincts taking over. I'm just saying we could revisit the terms, find a more reasonable arrangement that works for everyone. The terms aren't negotiable. But surely Dad didn't mean for this to be a punishment, did he? I stood up and walked to the window overlooking the backyard, where George had taught all 3 children to ride bicycles. Alexander, what did you think would happen when you stood up at your father's funeral and announced that I would be taken care of? Did you think I would smile and nod and accept that my children had publicly declared me a burden? We never said you were a burden. I turned to face him. You didn't have to say it. Every person in that chapel understood exactly what you meant. The front door opened and Daisy's voice called out, Mom, Alexander's car is here. Are you both in the living room? She appeared in the doorway, still in her work clothes, her lawyer's briefcase in one hand and a bag from my favorite bakery in the other. Gabriel followed behind her, looking even more haggard than Alexander. We brought cinnamon rolls, Daisy said, holding up the bag from Presti's. I remember you always bought them for Sunday breakfast when we were kids. I did. Remember? Every Sunday for 18 years until my children grew up and moved away and decided they were too busy for family breakfast traditions. We need to talk, Gabriel said, his voice serious. All of us about how this is going to work. Sit down, I told them, gesturing to the sofa. They arranged themselves carefully, maintaining the united front they'd perfected since childhood, but I could see the cracks beginning to show. Daisy pulled out her legal pad. I've been researching the will's enforceability. Dad was very thorough, but there are always options for modification if all parties agree. I don't agree, I said simply. Mom, please listen. The financial burden this places on us is significant. Alexander's got the new house mortgage, I've got law school loans that won't be paid off for another 8 years, and Gabriel just started his practice. None of us has $96,000 lying around. Then you'll have to make sacrifices. I said the same way your father and I made sacrifices for you. Gabriel was crying again, quiet tears that he didn't bother to hide. Mom, I can't afford this. Do you understand? My veterinary practice barely breaks even. I'm living paycheck to paycheck as it is. Then perhaps you should have thought of that before you decided I was something to be managed from a distance. Daisy set down her pen and looked directly at me. What do you want from us, Mom? What will it take to make this right? It was the first honest question any of them had asked since the funeral. I considered my answer carefully, watching their faces and measuring the depth of their desperation. I want you to understand, I said finally, what it feels like to have the people you love most in the world treat you like an inconvenience. I want you to remember what it cost me to raise you, to support your father's business, to put your needs before my own for 30 years. I want you to experience what it's like when your security depends entirely on someone else's goodwill. But we're your children, Alexander protested. We love you. Do you? I asked, because love isn't something you feel, Alexander. It's something you do. And what you did was stand up at your father's funeral and publicly humiliate the woman who raised you. The room fell silent except for the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the corner, another piece George had bought for our 10th anniversary, another reminder of the life we'd built together that our children had been so eager to dismantle. The terms of your father's will are non-negotiable, I continued. You will provide the required financial support, you will treat me with the respect I deserve, and you will remember that your inheritance depends entirely on my satisfaction with your efforts." Daisy's lawyer instincts kicked in one more time. "And what does satisfaction mean exactly? What are the specific criteria we need to meet?" I smiled for the first time since George's death, a cold expression that seemed to unnerve all three of my children. "You'll know you're meeting my expectations," I said, "when I stop feeling like I'm being managed from a distance." They left shortly after that, taking their flowers, their bakery treats, and their carefully drafted care plans. But they left something else behind, the comfortable assumption that their mother would be grateful for whatever scraps of attention they chose to throw her way. From my living room window, I watched them cluster around Alexander's car in my driveway, their heads bent together in urgent conference. They were probably strategizing, calculating, trying to figure out the most efficient way to minimize their losses while meeting their obligations. But they were missing the most important point. This wasn't about efficiency anymore. This was about justice, and justice, I was discovering, required a much more personal touch. 6 months have passed since that day in the lawyer's office, and I'm sitting here in the same navy dress I wore to the will reading, looking into this camera to tell you how it all ended. Not with redemption or forgiveness or some heartwarming family reconciliation, but with the cold satisfaction of watching people reap exactly what they sowed. My children kept their word. Technically, the $8,000 appears in my account on the 1st of every month, transferred from Alexander's business account because he's the only one with sufficient cash flow to handle the immediate burden. Daisy sends him her portion quarterly, which strains her already tight budget. Gabriel had to sell his house and move into a 2-bedroom apartment to make his share of the payments. They call every Sunday, the three of them on speakerphone, asking about my health, my needs, my general welfare. The conversations are stilted, formal, like customer service calls from people reading scripts. They've learned to say the right words, but there's no warmth behind them, no genuine affection, just the careful compliance of people who understand the financial consequences of failure. I let them suffer through these performances for 3 months before I implemented the first real test of their commitment. It started with a simple request. I called Alexander on a Tuesday morning and told him I needed help moving some furniture in the basement. Nothing heavy, just George's old filing cabinets that I wanted reorganized. "Can't you hire someone?" he asked. "I have a board meeting at 10. "I suppose I could," I said, "but I thought you might want to handle it personally. After all, there might be some of your father's papers down there that would interest you." He arrived 30 minutes later, still in his suit, clearly annoyed at the interruption to his schedule. The basement was dusty, filled with 30 years of accumulated possessions, Christmas decorations, old furniture, boxes of photographs from when my children still wanted to spend holidays with their parents. "What exactly needs to be moved?" Alexander asked, checking his watch. I led him to the filing cabinets in the corner for tall metal units filled with George's business documents from the early years. "I want these relocated to the other side of the room, but first I need you to go through them and remove any documents that might be important to the business succession." It took him 6 hours of kneeling on the concrete floor in his expensive suit, sorting through decades of paperwork, sneezing from the dust, missing his board meeting and 2 client calls. I brought him coffee once, watching him struggle with boxes that were probably heavier than anything he'd lifted in years. But here's the beautiful part. Buried in the 3rd filing cabinet, between folders of old tax returns and insurance policies, he found the original partnership agreement for his father's business, the document that would have given him significantly more control over daily operations than the current trust arrangement allowed. His face lit up when he found it, the first genuine emotion I'd seen from him in months. "Mom, this is incredible. Do you know what this means?" "I could restructure the entire," I interrupted quietly. "What did you just call this?" He looked confused. "What did I call what? You said you could restructure the entire what?" I watched the understanding dawn on his face. He'd been about to say the entire company, as if it belonged to him, as if 6 hours of manual labor had earned him the right to take control of everything his father had built. I just meant I thought maybe there were opportunities for improvement. I'm sure you did. I took the partnership agreement from his hands. I'll have James review this and determine if it's still relevant. The document went into my safe that evening, along with several other papers I discovered over the months, insurance policies with unexpected beneficiaries, investment accounts Alexander didn't know existed, real estate holdings that weren't mentioned in the will reading. Information is power, and I was building quite a collection. Daisy's test came a month later. I called her office on a Friday afternoon and told her I needed legal advice about a dispute with my homeowner's insurance company. Nothing serious, just some questions about coverage for storm damage to the roof. Mom, I don't practice insurance law. You should probably consult a specialist. I'd prefer to keep this in the family, I said, unless you're too busy to help your mother. She arrived at my house that evening with a briefcase full of research materials and a resigned expression. We sat at my kitchen table while she explained the intricacies of homeowners' coverage, storm damage protocols, and claim dispute procedures. So what exactly is the insurance company disputing? She asked after an hour of explanation. Oh, there's no dispute, I said. I just wanted to understand my options. Daisy stared at me. There's no actual insurance problem? Not at the moment, but knowledge is valuable, don't you think? Now I know exactly what my coverage includes thanks to your thorough research. She spent the weekend drafting a comprehensive analysis of my insurance policies, home, auto, life, medical, creating a detailed guide to my legal protections and options. 47 pages of professional legal work that I filed away with all my other newfound knowledge about my children's capabilities. Gabriel's test was the cruelest, but then again, he'd always been the most sentimental of my children. The one who used to crawl into bed with us during thunderstorms, who cried when we had to put down our old dog Rex, who still called me Mama sometimes when he thought no one was listening. I called him on the anniversary of George's death and told him I was feeling lonely, that I needed company for the evening. Could he come over and just sit? With me, maybe? Look through some old photo albums. He came immediately, still in his veterinary scrubs, smelling like disinfectant and animal fur. We sat on the living room sofa with boxes of photographs spread between us, pictures from their childhood, family vacations, birthday parties, graduations. Remember this? I asked, holding up a photo of 5-year-old Gabriel on his first day of kindergarten, clutching a lunchbox shaped like a dinosaur. You cried because you thought the other kids would make fun of your lunchbox. I remember, he said softly. You told me that anyone who made fun of dinosaurs wasn't worth being friends with anyway. And what happened? 3 other kids had dinosaur lunchboxes too. We all sat together at lunch and pretended we were paleontologists. We went through dozens of photos, each one a reminder of the mother I'd been, the sacrifices I'd made, the love I'd poured into raising them. Gabriel cried several times, touching the pictures with gentle fingers, remembering a childhood that must have seemed like it belonged to someone else's family. Mom, he said finally, his voice breaking, I'm so sorry for what we said, for how we treated you. I know it doesn't matter now. I know we can't take it back, but I need you to know that I remember. I remember everything you did for us. I looked at my youngest son, my baby, crying over photographs of a family that no longer existed and felt nothing, no forgiveness, no softening of my resolve, no maternal instinct to comfort him. Do you know what I remember, Gabriel? I asked. I remember you standing next to your siblings at your father's funeral and nodding along when they announced I would be cared for from a distance. I remember you looking right at me while they said it. He flinched as if I'd slapped him. I was scared. Alexander and Daisy had it all planned out, and I didn't know how to argue with them. I should have stood up for you, but I was a coward. Yes, I agreed. The photo albums went back into their boxes that night, but not before I selected a few pictures to keep on my mantle, Images of my children when they were young and innocent and still believed their mother was the most important person in their world, before they learned to calculate the cost of loving me. Now, 6 months later, my children continue their careful compliance with their father's will. They've learned to perform the rituals of care without the substance of love. They've discovered that duty enforced is a hollow substitute for duty freely given. But here's what they still don't understand. This was never about the money. This was about showing them who they really were when they thought no one was watching. This was about stripping away their comfortable assumptions and forcing them to confront the truth about themselves. They failed that test spectacularly, and now they get to live with the consequences every day for the rest of their lives, paying for the privilege of maintaining a relationship with a mother who no longer loves them. Turns out it's expensive, but watching people pay for their cruelty with their own misery, that's priceless. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Some stories don't have happy endings, and that's exactly how they should be.